Good. Well, thank you very much for joining us today. Very warm welcome to those who have only just joined us. I'm Lee Parsons, Marketing Director at Office Principals. So much of the workforce is currently working from home at the current time, and for many, this is a first-time experience. Working from home is very different to working in the office, and many of us are concerned about the best way to manage people that are working remotely. How can we help people to work at their smartest and most productive while they're not in the office? I'm shortly going to be handing over to Hannah Nardini from WK Space, who's going to be presenting during this webinar. She's a specialist in commercial interior design, occupational psychology, and change management. If you do have any questions during the webinar, then please use the question and answer facility provided by Zoom. If you type in your questions, then we'll answer as many of them as possible at the end of the webinar. If we don't get to answer your particular question, then don't worry, we will be sending out an email at the end of the webinar. You can reply to the email with your questions and we'll get back to you as quickly as we can. So I'm now going to pass over to Hannah. Hannah, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. I'm just going to run you through a brief presentation. Hopefully it's going to be sort of 15-20 minutes, just running through some of the experiences that we may be having when we're working from home. It's certainly interesting times at the moment, so I'm just going to share with you some key bits of data as well that we've learned from recent studies. So let me try and move my sorry, bear with me. I'm struggling moving my slide forward. I love it when technology fails me at the final hour.
Always fails.
There we go.
We have
Right, let's jump straight through to the agenda. So, as I mentioned, we've recently conducted a load of research globally and also quite significantly within the UK. I'm just going to share with you some key snippets of information that's come from that. We're going to look specifically at things around motivation, productivity, and also how we keep ourselves healthy in every possible way, be that physically and also mentally. So those are the kind of key areas that we are going to be running through. Let's make a start with some of the data, and we're still churning quite a lot of it, so these are only sort of snippets that I can share with you right now. What we learned in the survey, we sent the survey out to 9,000 people, and we asked them a series of questions around what they're experiencing right now, what kind of setup they have, what would they like to see retained going forward, how do they think things will change. We made sure that this was issued to people who were not regular workers from home. So these are people who are full-time employed in office-based roles who haven't been followed at the moment as well. What was quite reassuring, 51% of people felt that they already had a pretty suitable setup to be working from home. And when we say appropriate, their definition of appropriate was coming through as I have a kitchen table to work at, or I have a dining table to work at more specifically. What was slightly alarming about this bit of data was that there was only 9% of people who said that they actually had an ergonomic and adjustable environment. By that, we would refer to things like an additional monitor, which would raise the height up through to a height adjustable chair. So actually appropriate to some extent, but we do know that this in itself can cause issues further down the line. So let's just quickly look at what your legal requirements are. If you are an employer who's on this webinar right now, what could this potentially mean for you? If you go onto the HSE website, it actually says that temporary workers don't need to do a workplace or a workstation assessment. However, what they fail to define is how long is temporary. Now, we're in this situation of lockdown. We're 3 weeks in. Who knows how long this potentially could extend for. So there's a little bit of ambiguity around the expectations or the obligations upon an employer right now. There's some useful guidance, and I've given you the link here to a website. It's considered prudent to perhaps issue a checklist, a very simple checklist, and it's a workstation assessment that would be issued to employees, just enabling them to understand type of environment they've got. And it would enable you as an employer to consider whether you should be looking at any particular adjustments to their environment, maybe through the provision of extra equipment. But we do also want to think longer term. If we're going to see potentially more people working from home, a lot of companies may start to think, well, actually that's going to save us a significant amount of money because we're not going to be having to take as much office accommodation. But the one word of warning to this is if employees are more likely to become a regular worker at home, and that by Unison is deemed at around 50% of their time, you do have an obligation to provide a suitable work space for them to actually occupy during that time. So we always need to make sure that those costs are counted, maybe as part of your considerations. So this is quite a reassuring stat, I felt. 53% of people said that they actually felt less stressed since working from home. And this is more relative to those who have newly discovered working from home, should we say. We already know that stress levels amongst regular home workers tend to be relatively low anyway. So when we ask people more specifically, well, why do you think you're feeling less stressed in this current scenario? Because there's lots of reasons potentially to be anxious. Some of the reasons they gave us: I'm not having to set an alarm every day, or I'm actually able to set my alarm slightly later than normal. I don't have the stress of a commute. And for some people, they were saying that that could potentially be up to 2 hours each way. Immediate action has been removed, which in turn is reducing stress levels. I'm working in a familiar environment. So yeah, that makes sense. But this was quite an interesting comment. I'll give you the direct quote, but there's actually a lot of comments that started to resonate with the sentiment behind this. Some people were saying it's the freedom from obnoxious managers and colleagues was coming through. So these are the reasons that were reported to have reduced stress. However, behind this figure, we also learned that 36% of people have said that they actually feel more stressed than normal. That's quite a proportion of your potential workforce are feeling more stressed. The potential reasons for this is the lack of structure, the lack of routine, the distractions and interruptions around them whilst they're trying to work. Some people we know just do not thrive in a home working environment, and we do know that this is likely to be a trigger of a higher stress response from themselves. Some people struggle with the fact that the work and the home life is now blended. There's no clear definition between the two. It's socially isolating, but there are some people who are concerned, rightly so, about the economic impact. So job security or financial issues can also be perhaps one of the reasons why people do feel slightly more stressed. So this was interesting because I've been reading lots of articles over the past few weeks about predictions of people saying that going forward, potentially we're going to see 50 to 70% of workers adopting a regular working from home pattern. And we actually asked this question to people of which elements do you feel you would like to see retained going forward? And it was interesting because it was only 20% of people who previously haven't been working from home have started to feel that actually this could work for me. I can do my role quite effectively in a remote scenario. So we saw 20% of people saying that they would like to see that as a more regular pattern. However, by the term regular, we're actually defining that as around 2 days a week, at a push maybe 3. But what we haven't seen is a high proportion of people saying, that's it, I'm only going to be working from home going forward. So maybe not quite the impact so far that we were expecting to see. But that does mean on top of the people who are ordinarily working from home, which in some businesses can be 20 to 30%, potentially we might be seeing around half of your workforce becoming a lot more transient and mobile. That will have an implication on workplace going forward, and also how we manage that particular scenario. If you're an employer, how you manage more of a remote workforce. We are very much thrust into this scenario at the moment, so hopefully there's a bit of a learning curve going on already. So this leads us on to motivation. 47% of people, that's a high percentage of people, have said that they're particularly struggling to get motivated to work. And this includes those people who are already familiar and established with working from home. So let's have a look a bit more specifically at the motivation. What we started to realise is when we broke this data down into age groups and demographics, it was particularly the Generation Z, which are the youngest of your workforce, around 18 to 22, and also the baby boomers. So we've put those as 51 plus. They have struggled the most with motivation to start working. This is also the cohort, though, that showed us that they do less working from home previously to this current crisis. But we see with Generation Z, a lot of them were mentioning that they don't particularly have a suitable setup to enable them to work effectively. Some of them are house sharing, they don't really have a space that's viable for them to work. They also like the interaction of being around others. There's a lot of coaching, mentoring and learning that happens in the presence of their colleagues. And we see with baby boomers, some of the instances that they mentioned was around the fact that they like a very definite work and home life. And for some of the baby boomers, not all, but for some, it's been quite a challenge to be kind of thrown into the mix of actually having to work from home. But that's not to say the other groups haven't struggled either. There's been a lot of challenges that exist across all of the generational groups. So psychologists have now been trying to work out, why is motivation particularly lower at this particular time? Now, they are assumptions and ideas, but what's come forward so far is the fact that it could be triggered by the monotony of the situation. We are in very much uncharted territory. And as humans, we don't cope too well when we don't know where the end is. And we're in this scenario where we don't know from week to week what's going to happen. So there is an element of uncertainty and anxiety that can go with that. But we're also in an environment where potentially we've got so many distractions and interruptions happening around us. So what I'm going to talk through now is just 8 really simple tips to help you motivate yourself, if it's yourself or your employees. Let's start with the first one, wake up early. Now, we did mention a moment ago, some people have said they feel less stressed on the fact they haven't had to set their alarm or they're setting it slightly later. We are creatures of habit. We rely and thrive on routines. And when our routine is interrupted or forcibly disrupted in this particular instance, it can actually trigger a series of emotions for us. And for some of us, that could be despair, it's anger, it's frustration, it's also feelings of helplessness. So it's particularly important in this time that we try and keep an orderly routine as much as possible. This is particularly important if you have children. Don't forget, you're around the children quite a lot, so you're setting an example. And it can be that this lack of motivation can be quite contagious. For homeschooling, we need children to realise that actually the day is for learning and they need to be motivated too. So always consider the example you set. But the other thing I'd say to consider is, let's be optimistic. Let's think about those post-holiday blues that we sometimes get when we've been away from work for 2 weeks. Just 2 weeks, and then we have to set the alarm on the Monday morning. Can you imagine the feelings that we're going to be getting when this finally ends and we go back to an element of normality and routine? Our body clocks change incredibly quickly, so it's really important that we try and maintain as much of a routine as possible. Point number 2 is get dressed. Now, there's lots of photographs on social media that I'm seeing of people who are kind of dressed on the top half, maybe wearing sort of jogging bottoms or underdressed at the lower half, very much based around what people see. There's actually a really interesting psychology around getting dressed. If you're interested, there's a really good book by Jennifer Baumgartner, and it's called You Are What You Wear. And it's incredibly true, and there's strong research that sits behind this. But if you're working in loungewear, it does actually show that it hinders your productivity. And it's because we have a very strong mental association that loungewear is associated with slumber and it's lethargy. But when we get dressed for work, it's psychologically a change in our mindset. And this is very much therefore linked to our confidence, it's our mood, it's also our performance when we are at work. Now, we're not saying get up at the crack of dawn and put your suit on, but it's about finding the balance. Where is your personal trigger point where it helps you emulate this working mindset, but also at the same time enables you to feel comfortable? And we also need to think at the end of the work day as a means of defining that that day of work has ended. Some people now are starting to adopt the practice of I then get changed in the evening so that I'm out of my work attire and I can start to associate my work time as opposed to my personal time. Do not work from your bedroom. Not all of us, I do appreciate, have the luxury of space, and sometimes we can't be that selective. However, it's also important to consider alternatives. Our brain has associations with location and behavior. So if you start to have a work and a non-work space that has a bit of a blurred line between it, you can actually find that this is a trigger, and it will suffer. Both elements of our work and our non-work life can suffer. In particular, can trigger sleeping difficulties. If you start to associate the place where you need to relax and go to sleep, if we start to associate that with work problems, stress and anxiety, we're starting to activate our brain into more problem-solving activities as opposed to relaxation. So that's one of the key elements. Always try and work in a space away from your bedroom. But we also know it's unhygienic. There's 15 million skin cells that are shedded during a night. Over a course of a week, that's equivalent to around 5 million bits of bacteria. If you are physically sat in bed working, you can double it. So we know it's an incredibly unhealthy habit, and it's also not great for your posture. It causes a lot of pressure on your lower back. Try and mimic your routine that you had previously. Now, this might mean that you need to stop for a few moments and create a schedule or a routine. Introduce simple things that you used to do in your workplace. It could be that you would go and get coffee at 10 o'clock, or you may have to schedule your lunch breaks into this, or your mid-afternoon break as well. It's easy for days to become blended together, so always take the time to write a schedule, but also make sure that you keep it. Stay active. We are becoming much more sedentary at the moment. We're not moving as much as normal. You'll notice this if you do your step counts. You may be averaging around 2,000 to 3,000 steps as opposed to the usual 10,000 that you might be doing. This is bad for our health. It's bad for our motivation. Exercise or just physical activity during the day will help boost our energy, and this in turn is known to boost our productivity. It helps clear thinking. It's also good to change your environment up a little bit. Now, we're allowed an hour a day, so use it wisely. Try and schedule elements of activity into your actual work day. In particular, try and get some daylight. Rewards. We're hearing a lot about people saying that they're consuming their own body weight in snacks and unhealthy food. So I'm not advocating go and buy cake, but you do need to balance the perks that come with working from home with your productivity and also discipline. It's quite easy to sit and binge watch Netflix and put off work until quite late in the evening. But actually, we need to consider using certain elements of this as a potential reward. It's also micro rewards. So for example, you could choose to have 2 hours of active time broken up with, I'm just going to watch an episode of something, or I'm going to read a book, or I'm going to take a quick break. So always try and break the day down into these small rewards, and it will give you a sense of accomplishment. It also helps the motivation because you know that you are earning opportunities that come with that. Which leads us to another point around distractions. Now, this is the same even when you're working in the office. It's something we talk to our clients about. Certain things can be a productivity killer. With constant pinging of email or social media, it actually breaks our productive flow and thinking, and it's quite hard to get back into that. So maybe this could be one of the areas of rewards. After working a certain period of time, maybe we consider, I'm just going to have a few minutes and I'm just going to check on social media. But there's another technique that's quite powerful. It's called the Pomodoro technique. It's something as a company that we practice individually. There's loads of different time management skills that you can learn from this. The one that we particularly like is this one though, where you set a timer. It could be 25 minutes, you might find 45 minutes, but you break tasks down and you work in set time. And after that time is up, you take a quick 5-minute break and then go back to another stint. And if you do this 4 times over, you then kind of earn a 20 to 30-minute break at the other end. So there are loads of techniques. If you haven't tried this before, I really recommend trying it. There's loads of apps that you can download that will help you get this started and scheduled. And final point to this is now about keeping in touch with others. You've all got at your disposal now, I'm sure, plenty of collaborative tools to enable you to connect with your colleagues, also with the company. So make sure you use them. We want to keep our social skills up. What we don't want to do is kind of slip back in habits or behaviours where we become very much insular and isolated. So always reach out to people and make you feel like you are connected and you are part of a team. So if you're a manager or a part of the leadership team, what could you be doing to help your teams? Remember I said at the beginning, we saw 47% of people who struggled with motivation. What's interesting is that dropped to just 22% when managers or leaders were in regular daily contact with individuals. And that's an important point to note. So manager, we need to really think about how you're connecting. The ideal scenario is short and frequent check-ins, but this isn't a check-up to check up, are you working? This is a check-in, are you okay? And your first few minutes of that conversation should be based around the individual and how are they feeling and how are you getting on before it moves to more of a work mode. Show people that they are valued and that you care for them. Let's also be empathetic. Some people are thrust into this scenario. They've got a lot of things happening around them. The 9-to-5 routine has changed. And as a manager, maybe we need to just be more considerate and tolerant of the fact that people are still finding their feet in this particular way of working. But be creative, find creative ways to stay connected. What some people are doing is they have a coffee hour or they have a pizza lunch. We've seen one scenario where pizzas got delivered to people's homes, on the company, of course, and people had a virtual lunch together. It could be happy hour with or without the manager potentially, but try and find creative ways to keep your team as connected as they possibly can be. So simple things around productivity and motivation will naturally help your productivity, but just some simple things. Make sure you've got a space that you can work. Try and have a designated space that is permanently set up for the duration of this lockdown where you can go and work. If there's lots of stuff happening around you, consider noise cancelling headphones. They'd actually work quite effectively. A to-do list. We've been big fans of Wunderlist, which I know has just been replaced by Microsoft as To-Do. It stops you relying on your memory, which may not be as optimized as it could be right now. But it's also a sense of achievement when you manage to tick off the things on your list. Eat a frog for breakfast. Some of you may have heard this term, a famous term by Mark Twain. And what he said was, if the first thing you do in the morning is eat a live frog, you can go through the rest of your day knowing the worst is behind you. And there's a lot of logic behind this. Tackle the worst task first. Pick the task that's likely to make you procrastinate and just get it done. Don't forget, use things like the Pomodoro technique to help you with that. But set boundaries. It's easy for people who are working from home to work incredibly long hours. Time just slips away sometimes. Make sure you have a very clear start and finish point to when you are working. Don't forget to take your breaks, changing your environment, keep active as we mentioned in the first part of motivation. But also keep your attitude in check. So this is quite an interesting one. Don't let the situation that we're in right now dwarf your happiness or your tranquility or even your productivity. The greatest power you've got is your perspective. And this can either victimize you or it can empower you. You're in control of this. So look for the opportunities, look for the personal development that could potentially come out of this. Figure out what you are in control of and focus on that as a key element. So what about staying physically healthy? Well, there's a lot of simple things that we would always endorse, and a lot of this is common sense to you. Caffeine is an interesting one. It's something that when you're working from home, and I'm a regular worker from home, that before you know it, you've had your 10 cups in the morning, which isn't great. Our shift in routine can actually make the impact of caffeine a lot more significant. So you may find that you do need to be a little bit more mindful of this. Also, if you remember, we said about where you're working. Ideally, you'd be getting daylight. People who work in a natural daylight environment are known to sleep on average around 46 extra minutes per night. And this is because of your circadian rhythms. So try and use this. If you can't work in daylight, make sure you're active and you go out in daylight during the day. But look after yourselves. Be mindful of what you're eating. Be careful of all of the things that you're doing. It's okay to look after yourself during this time. But ergonomics is important. So be mindful of the environment you're sat in. Sat on the floor or on the sofa and you're bent over on your laptop is not going to be great for you. So consider the chair. If you need to put cushions because you haven't got an ergonomic chair, do that. Or if you need to put stacks of paper to raise the screen up, always consider these basic elements. So another area of research that we thought was quite interesting, we asked people when they return to work, what do they think a priority would be for the company? What would they like to see introduced? And what came through from this is 37% of people said that the company should be offering specific mental health support. Now, in particular, we saw it was Gen Z, the younger age group, again, the 18 to 22-year-olds, and the millennials, particularly mentioned the mental health issues that potentially they're struggling with at the moment. Now, that's not to say other groups aren't suffering from this too. As we mentioned at the beginning, we're in uncharted territory. And this isn't something that employers can put off and wait until you return to the workplace. Something you need to start thinking about now. I just want to draw your attention to this useful resource. It's the first of its kind website. You can have it as an app. It's called the Hub of Hope. And it's the first time that the National Mental Health Database has been put into one source. So you simply type in your address and it will give you all of the mechanisms and resources that are around you to get any support and help that you need at that given point. So it's worth sharing this information with others. But for you personally, think about your own mental health. All of us have to consider this. We're bombarded constantly by 24-hour news cycles, social media. Try and learn to switch off. Yes, you need to keep up to date, but seek out the most reliable of sources and then learn to disregard the rest. There's an element of over kind of anxiety that can be created from this. But if you are struggling, talk to other people, talk to your managers if you're an employee, but use the resources that are available to you locally and look after yourselves. Find what it is that works for you individually to help you relax or maybe become less anxious. So take this opportunity to perhaps explore that element of your own personality. But what about if you're an employer on this webinar? What should you be doing now, but also in future to support your employees? Let's think first about those who've been furloughed. Just stop and give a moment's thought of how they may be feeling. And it's something maybe that hasn't been considered too much, but people may have a feeling of being undervalued. They could be anxious. Is this a reflection of my job security going forward? Am I going to lose my job? Is that something I need to think about? Some people may feel guilty because they're furloughed and they're not working, but they're watching their colleagues who aren't in that scenario working manically to take up the slack. Just think about how people may be feeling. Be completely clear and transparent and open with your communication. If you don't know the answer, it's okay to say that. But we don't want to be making assumptions on anything. So just be as open with people as you can be. Do they need support? Do they maybe live on their own? Have they got a support mechanism around them? So think about them on as a personal level. And we're not saying you individually go around and do their shopping for them, but can you put them in touch with local resources that would maybe help them. If you run an employee assistance program, an EAP, that would still be active even though they're furloughed. So make sure that they have the contact information to take up on those opportunities if needed. But keep in touch, have regular wellbeing calls. As we mentioned, try and talk to people daily. If people are furloughed though, circumstances will change. So maybe consider a group chat where everybody can talk together and actually use each other as a support mechanism. But also start to plan the return to work. Let's start to think about the impact this is going to have on the culture and the morale of your people when they go back to work. We've gone through a period of isolation and disconnection, and what are you going to do as an employer to help bond this back together? But also think about the impact that may have on customer services going forward as well. We need to think about the bigger and wider impact to all of these things. So there are things as an employer you should be doing now, and things that you need to start to plan for going forward. So that very much brings us to the end of our presentation. Look at this very much as an opportunity of what could come out of this. It's a learning experience for all of us. Nobody truly knows what happens next. There's a lot of research that we're doing and a lot of assumptions that we can make. There's a number of tools which we've just listed here that myself as a company at WK Space on Office Principles can help you with. So we've got a series of engagement surveys that you could take up. They're 5-minute pulse surveys just to gauge how people are feeling. The planning the return to work. What do you have to do to get your workplace ready? If we are looking at social distancing potentially for 12, 18, 24 months, you need to think about getting your workplace ready for that. But also thinking about the longer term impact this may have on your employees and also the workplace going forward. So if you need any assistance with any of these areas, then please do get in touch with us. So at the end, I will hand back to Lee.
Thank you very, very much, Hannah, for that really interesting presentation. So we've got a couple of questions. If anybody else has got a question, then please use the Q&A button in the bar at the bottom to type in your question now, and we'll spend a few minutes answering those questions for you. So there's been a bit of interest around the survey, Hannah, that you mentioned at the beginning that you sent out to 9,000 people.
Yeah.
And I just wondered if you would be able to help a couple of interested people with where they can find out any more about that, whether there's any further results. I know that I think you're launching something about this in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're currently reviewing all of the data. We're running our first webinar on Monday at 10 a.m. to share the first findings from the UK. So if you're interested in finding out more, then please do drop an email to us or go onto LinkedIn or through Lee. We're happy to share information as it comes through. We will be running other sessions as well, which are relative to other countries. So we ran this across the whole of North America, Europe and Asia. So if you've also got colleagues that are based there and you want to understand maybe the impact this is having in their environment, then we can also facilitate those kind of discussions as well.
Thanks. Question that's just come in: should employers ask staff working at home to account for how they have spent their time? Interesting one.
Oh, this is a good question. So managing on outputs as opposed to inputs, and this is an area when we run our change management with organisations, is one of the biggest areas of concern for managers. We've gone away all of a sudden from a presenteeism and seeing people think that they're working to suddenly we're starting to look at what's been produced as a means of measuring how productive people are being. As we mentioned, the current scenario is throwing up different levels of emotions for people. The routines are all over the place. We've got people who are having to homeschool children or maybe look after others in the family. It's therefore we mentioned about the need for the empathy of the 9 to 5 is incredibly hard to administer because some people cannot dedicate a pure division of time in that particular way, and therefore as an employer and a manager, we need to potentially be a little bit more flexible in the hours. There are some people who will work better in stints early in the morning, a bit of a break, working later in the afternoon. We do need to work with people on this. So as managers, you need to make sure that you're doing your regular check-in every day, check people are okay, but use it as a one-to-one opportunity to check people, understand what they need to be doing, make sure they are motivated, but also understand the expectation that you as a manager have for them. So yeah, it's not an easy one to answer. It's going to vary by individual. Those that are already familiar with working from home, or those managers who are already in a system of measuring on outputs, will find this relatively straightforward. For everyone else, it's learning, and we need to learn from this.
Excellent. I think that's basically it on the questions. So I think we can safely say the webinar is now coming to a close. So thank you very much, everybody, for attending. We will be sending out an email shortly. A couple of you have asked for some of the references to the app that was mentioned earlier on in the presentation, so we'll include that in the email. Hannah mentioned at the end of the webinar regarding the engagement surveys and some of the items that we can help you with there. So if anyone is interested in that survey, then please respond to the email that we send out, and we'll get back to you as quickly as we can. Just a quick point to note that Office Principles is currently offering an Office Renew program. So if your office is currently empty, with everyone working from home, then we're able to come in, refresh it, sanitize it, completely clean the office so that it's ready for staff to come back to. And I think that also comes back to what Hannah mentioned, planning the return to work. So if you've got any concerns around that whole area, that's something that we're able to help you with. So please get in touch if you're interested. We trust you found this webinar interesting. Please keep an eye out for future webinars. We've got a few more in the pipeline, so keep an eye out for that. And I think that's everything from us for now. So thank you very much, everyone, and goodbye.
Thank you.